It's good to be with you. As Carol mentioned, I'm Jim Hazelwood. I serve as the Bishop of the New England Synod, which is made up of the 6 states of the states of New England. We're the 4th largest geographic synod in the ELCA. And several years ago, I had a theory that one of the aspects that I wanted to see developed or strengthened in our congregations, not only in New England, but across the church, across not just Lutherans, but the Christian church in general, is a strengthening of our understanding of spirituality. I think this is one of the more challenging areas, particularly for Lutherans, because while we have a strong faith, that faith is often defined as let's say, just an intellectual faith, as opposed to a faith that includes more aspects of life. So I decided to, first it was just going to be a little tiny book, booklet, almost a pamphlet, but as I was writing, it grew and grew. And I came up with this concept called everyday spirituality, which is the idea that spirituality is not just reserved for what happens on Sunday morning in the sanctuary, although it happens there, but it happens in everyday aspects of our lives, in the daily coming and going, whether it's the grocery store, the chiropractor office, the accountant's office, in the garden, and various other places. And so I put together this book. And I think what we're going to do today is I'm going to provide for you an introduction to everyday spirituality through a video I'd like to show. It's about 15 minutes long. It's a video that I made actually for the folks in Pennsylvania for their synod a couple of weeks ago. So I'm going to show this and then come back. I'll talk a little bit more. And then what would be great is for question and answer, thoughts, reflections, feedback, and we can do that either via the Q&A box or by actually having you raise your hand and saying you'd like to talk. So let me start by sharing my screen and showing you this video.
You didn't think that I was going to do a keynote by sitting behind my desk. Hey, I'm in the middle of one of my more enjoyable spiritual practices. Yep. I'm at the end of about 24 miles on a bike, going down a little quiet path. I'm going to put my bike back at home. Listen, let's check out some other ways in which you can express your spirituality every day. It's not just reserved for church, although it's there. It's not just in the sacraments, although it's there. It's everywhere. Let's find out how. Check it out. One of the ways that spirituality works for me is movement through my body, whether it's hiking on a trail like this or on my bicycle or different ways, swimming in the pond or lake or swimming pool. Different engagements with moving connects me with my heart, my lungs, my legs, my muscles. Fresh air. All of this is an expression of spirituality, everyday spirituality. Why? Because we as Christians we believe that in an incarnated God. In other words, while we acknowledge that God is in the wind, blowing in the wind, God is also in the person of Jesus Christ. And we are now, as St. Teresa of Avila said, to butcher her quote, we're the hands and feet of Jesus. And so movement is for me an act of prayer. Now, I know there are people that can get up every morning at 5 a.m. and they have a devotional book and they can meditate in prayer, and they can do that 7 days a week. I have an aunt who does that. While meditation is something that I do practice, prayer is something I do practice, I've never been able to stick with an annual yearly devotional book for more than 8 days, if that. Yet, put me on a trail like this by myself on an early spring day, and it is all prayer. Sometimes out loud. A day like today, there is nobody out here. It's early spring in New England. It's about 44 degrees, and people aren't interested in this. But I'll hike this trail. And some of my most profound encounters with God have happened in nature. What about you? Does moving your body, getting out, exercising in an informal or formal way, connect you with parts of yourself that you didn't even know existed? Does the rumble thumble of your heart make you go, oh, I'm alive? This is a gift. And it is a gift. And we can so often take it for granted. So everyday spirituality, one of the ways that works for me is moving my body, whether that's outside or inside. How about you? Do you engage in prayerful movement? It's time to go into the Holy of Holies. Yep. A bank. So here's the thing. Please take your cash. Return card, please. I'd like my card back. Thank you. Give me the receipt. I am engaging in spirituality. Not so much with the withdrawal, although I suppose a little bit, but more, what am I going to do with this? Of all the things that Jesus talked about, he talked about this stuff more than anything else. Yep, you look it up. I'm not wrong. I've done the research. Everyday spirituality is how we use this. What are we going to do with this? Oh, look, there's a friend of mine in the car over there. She's getting some money too. This is a real coincidence. She's looking at me like there's something wrong with me because she thinks I'm talking to myself and holding up money. It's pretty, yeah. Hi, how are you doing? I know, I'm making a movie. Anyway, let's go get spiritual, do some stuff with this. Is there anything more spiritual than turning this into that? Bread, wine, the daily necessities and gifts of God. Yes. So here's the deal. They don't really want me filming into it, but I'm going to get some of those. Some of those. Ooh. And some of these. And I'm going to go over here. And I'm going to get some of this. Now, this is New England. So we got to get our wine at a liquor store. Can't do that in a grocery store like we can in California. I got to get out of here before I get in trouble. COVID hit, I did what a lot of other people did. Started a garden. Now you'll notice if you've read the book Everyday Spirituality, in there, I'm not much of a gardener. In fact, it is not my job. Well, it wasn't until last year, and I have no idea why or what changed or what shifted, but clearly God had something in mind. So that chapter on garden, it's all wrong. Well, it's all right, except for the part where I say, I don't do the gardening. No, I do a lot of the gardening. Let's check it out. So the idea here was to make something that could yield vegetables. I wanted to be vegetable gardening. Now it's early spring, so there's not much going on. And yes, we have cheated with that lettuce back there. That is from some already grown. But this is an amazing experience of God's work. Composting, all our trash, I won't bother to throw at you garbage as in compostable trash. And that's going to be asparagus. Man, that's going to be a bear. For some reason, this whole experience is connecting me to the earth in ways I've never experienced before. Now, some might say it's a hobby. Yeah, that's true. What about you? Do you garden? Maybe your gardening is more like this, flowering trees and plants and so forth. It doesn't matter what it is. It's an awesome way to connect with God's creation. So gardening, it's a gift. And the vegetables, considering the number of tomatoes we got out of that last year, send me an email. I'll have to ship them to you because we won't be able to eat them all. And the yellow crook squash, I've been squashed all fall and winter long. Anyway, gardening, getting your hands in the soil, an expression of your faith. Imagine that. One of the things that Martin Luther talks about in his description of that part of the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. If you look in the Small Catechism, what does Luther say is daily bread? He's not just talking about bread, as in the loaf that we saw in the grocery store. He's talking about everything. Look at that list. Look up that part of the Small Catechism. It is a wonderful expression. Give us this day our daily bread is not simply about bread. It is about asparagus and squash and tomatoes and fruits and vegetables and all that we consume that give us life and that connect us with God's creation. It's a great gift. And it's an expression of your faith. So the next time you go to the garden store, just have a little bow of gratitude to the gardener or the proprietor of that store because he or she is making it possible for you to live your faith. All of the stories that people wrote to me when I wrote the book, Everyday Spirituality, by far the most common descriptions of encounters with God, with the holy, with the sacred, with that which is mysterious and beyond yet present, were stories about death. I've come here to a cemetery in Westerly, Rhode Island, where there's a number of people that I buried when I served a congregation here. One of them was months old. You know, you may think I'm a little odd, but I sometimes come to this cemetery or others, but mostly it's this one, because I need to be re-reminded of time. I need to be re-reminded of the limitations, and I need to be re-reminded that affects us in how we live now and is not the final word. There are other people that come to this cemetery. They come for different reasons. Some people come to just, well, it's a place to walk. Sometimes I'll see somebody drive by like that relatively young couple. And I wonder, were they here for just a nice walk? Were they visiting the grave of somebody? Everyday spirituality is reinforced by our encounter with the finite. So I think it was Martin Luther who said that we are born again each day, which is a different take on the whole concept of being born again than we've heard about in kind of American evangelical Christianity. I'm assuming Luther's right. Every morning we wake up, we're born again. And when you think about it, each night is kind of like a little death. Well, it's been a good day, and I'm going to sleep. I don't know about you, but I enjoy sleep. Now, sometimes I don't always get the best night's sleep. I tend to sometimes wake up at like 3 in the morning, and then my mind gets going, do you have that? And you can't go back to sleep. But when I have a good night's sleep, it's so rich and so wonderful. It has to be a gift from God. That's the way I look at it. The other thing that happens at night is we dream. And dreams are, in many ways, think of them as unopened letters from God. Yep, unopened, because for the most part, many of us we have a dream, or we say we don't remember, or we don't pay any attention. I don't know about you, but I got a journal right here next to my bed, and I write down my dreams. And I talk about them with my spiritual director. And I also have a dream group that I'm a part of, and we share our dreams. It's a great way to explore and kind of work that concept that maybe this is a letter from God. You look back in the Old and the New Testament, and there are a lot of people pay a lot of attention to their dreams. When you're sleeping, you are engaged in everyday spirituality. So I'm about to go pray. Night.
All right. Well, there you go. That gives you a bit of a glimpse of some of the aspects of everyday spirituality and some different approaches to it. So just to kind of highlight a couple of pieces that I talk about in the book, I divide it into 3 different sections. Things we do every day, things we do every week, and then things we do every so often. And so if you're familiar with the book, you're familiar with these, but I'll just hit a couple of highlights and mention some things, and then we can talk about it and we can have a question and answer conversation. So one of the things that I talk about in the first section of the book is these activities. They're all verbs. They are actions that we engage in on a daily basis. I start with breathing. Yep, breathing. When you look back into the Old Testament, it is the breath of God, the ruach, that gets breathed into Adam. That is the first breath we take. We take in the breath of God, and we continue to breathe that every day. Thanking, that simple act of gratitude, of offering thanks, is much a part of Paul's letter in the New Testament. And so how we express our gratitude is also an expression of everyday spirituality. And then I go into the taste, into the senses: tasting, smelling, moving, sleep and movement I mentioned in the video. And then I conclude that section with laughter. Laughter as this expression of everyday spirituality. There's a painting, and oh, here it is. It comes from the 1970s. It's this picture of Jesus laughing. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but I love this portrait of Jesus. And it's just, you know, it captures a side of Jesus that, yeah, we think about, but not often enough. And so when we laugh, we're exercising spirituality. One of the things I got to do several years ago is I would always wanted to do stand-up comedy. So I went and took a class and I had a 10-minute stand-up comedy performance. Oh my gosh, hardest thing I've ever done in my whole life. I've ridden my bicycle from Rhode Island to Cleveland, Ohio. That was nothing in comparison to trying to do stand-up comedy. That is hard work to do it well. Then the next section is things we do every week. I talk about friendship, trust, questioning, cooking. Now, cooking, for some of you, isn't that a daily chore? Unfortunately, in the United States, it's becoming more and more of a weekly chore. Singing. My wife's spirituality is deeply rooted in her love of singing. That is her form of prayer. And she sings often, and sometimes I feel like I'm in a musical, traveling, serving others. And then the last section, the book kind of progresses and goes a little in the more challenging direction. The last section, things we do every so often, that's where I talk about gardening. But I also talk about things like challenge, like when we're faced with challenges or adversity, there's a spirituality in that. The act of surrender, of giving up control. I don't know about you, but something that I have a hard time with, and I know a lot of people, but that learning how to do that is an act of spirituality. I even have a chapter that I called Disagree. In other words, when we have disagreements with people and groups of people, there's a spirituality in that, in how we live through that. And then the book closes out with the chapter on grieve, which, as I mentioned in the video, when I solicited people's stories of their connections with God, that and nature were the two #1 areas that people wrote to me about. And so profound stories of people that had mystical experiences of connections with God as they grieved the loss of a loved one. And the book closes out with wonder, this just sense of mystery and openness. My whole purpose and effort here in this idea of everyday spirituality is to try to broaden people's understanding of what is spirituality, and to say, yes, it happens in our congregations, it happens in the sacraments, it happens in the hearing of the word and in worship. It also happens in the grocery store, at the bank, in our interactions with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I know one of my most profound experiences when I became a grandfather a couple of years ago is the whole exchange between my identity as a grandparent and my relationship with two really active young boys. But my point is, these daily experiences we have are ways in which we encounter God. So I just wanted to give you that broad opening and kind of picture of everyday spirituality. I did also develop a kind of a card game that goes along with it. These are 25 cards with different questions on it to help people have conversations. And so we can do that. If we have some time today, I can show you how that works. But first, let's take some time now and have conversation. So if you have questions, comments, things you'd like to comment about that, you can either type them in that Q&A box that's down at the bottom right of your Zoom screen, or if you prefer to speak, Carol can acknowledge you and then you can turn on your microphone. So reactions, thoughts, am I completely off base? What are you thinking? What are you wondering about here? I'll take it anyway. How does God respond? In other words, how do we know if God is responding to this? That's a really good question. So here's how I'll answer that question. I recently came across a book called Primary Speech. It's a It's called The Psychology of Prayer, and it's written by an Episcopalian, Anne Ulanoff. And she has this sentence in the middle of her book, and it's in the middle of a paragraph. It affected me deeply. In fact, I printed it out. It's on my wall behind the computer. She's talking about questioning, and she says, this central questioning of God is one of the ways we reach most directly to God. I just found that quote so helpful, because I don't know about you, and one of the chapters in the book is on questioning, is that I've often thought I need to have all the answers, or I need to have it all figured out. But I've really, in truth, had a lot of questions. And here she was really affirming that that process of questioning, of asking questions, is the way in which, or is one way, she says, is one of the ways we reach most directly to God. And so I found that very, very helpful and very affirming, that the process of questioning is actually an expression of spirituality. So the next question that I see here, I hope that helps, Evelyn. I don't know if that's exactly what you wanted. Let me know. Feel free to write more. Sue-Ann writes, hi and thank you. What kind of pushback, if any, have you received to this concept of everyday spirituality? So that's a really good question. And I would say the one thing that I have had people comment on, I would say two things. One is, am I making spirituality too easy? In other words, well, if it's just a part of everyday life, then we just kind of go on with our life and we don't need to do anything. And that largely comes from people for whom the spiritual disciplines are very meaningful. You know, and what I mean by spiritual disciplines, for those of you who are not familiar, a devotional book, a regular morning practice of singing a hymn or praying prayers or having a time of meditation. And one of my responses is that I learned is that most people, of all the people that practice those kinds of rather disciplined forms of spiritual practice, they make up about 10% of the population. About 10% of the population engages in that kind of regular, prayerful, meditation, devotional practice. I want you all to know I affirm that. In fact, there's a part of me that's really jealous of that. I guess what I've tried to do is to write a book for the other 90%. And am I making spirituality too easy? Possibly. What I'm really trying to do is call attention to our everyday living as an expression of our faith. That's the goal that's behind this. I would say the second area that I've gotten a little bit of pushback on is there anything that is not spiritual? And they've kind of gone in the direction of evil and suffering. And my response is absolutely, that's a legitimate point. And guess what? That's what I'm hoping will be the focus of the next book. As I've been looking at the book of Job from the Old Testament, one of, if not the oldest book in terms of the origin of that story of Job, and the whole question of human suffering and evil. So I've had that in my mind. I've got a stack of books over here and some notes and some stories that people have written me. So those are the two areas of pushback. Thank you. Really good question. All right, Sue-Ann, thanks. It seems what you are lifting up for us is encouragement to be mindful. Absolutely. Mindful of all we do as a connection to the divine. That is exactly right. In fact, John Hoffmeyer, who's a professor at seminary in Philadelphia, said that I was highlighting the spirituality of Simone Weil, W-E-I-L, who was mid-20th century, who basically had a spirituality of paying attention. And that is in many ways what I'm doing. I'm saying, hey, when you go to the grocery store, try to consciously bring to mind as I'm shopping, I'm expressing my spirituality. So that's great to get that feedback. I'm going to move towards a little bit of an example of the deck of cards. So these are 25 cards, and they each have, I'll show them to you, they each have a question on them. So you can see this one says, what gives you great joy? And each of the 25 cards has a different question. Now, some of them are rather simple and the kind of question that anybody could answer, whether they are in a church context or not. Others of them go a little bit deeper. And what I've encouraged people to do is to take these cards, use them in small groups as discussion starters. Now, there are some people that are very comfortable talking about their faith and the connection between their daily life and their spirituality. But again, thinking of that 90%, I find that people need a warm-up before, if you just ask them, so where have you seen God this week? It's a perfectly appropriate question. But for a lot of folks in mainline churches, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalian, they're a little startled by that question right off the bat. But if you ask them instead, what gives you great joy? Well, what would you talk about? Would you talk about having a meal with friends? Would you talk about being with family? Would you talk about an activity that you enjoy? So let's just go through a couple of these questions. And I'd like you, if you want to put your answer in the Q&A, you can. If not, just think about it for yourself. I'll pull up a couple of different ones. So here, the next one is, describe a time when you were surprised. Describe a time when you were surprised. Could be by love, by children, by God. Pick one. Describe a time when you were surprised. Now that's an easy question to answer. Anybody can talk about that. And what I would suggest is that moment of surprise, maybe that is an expression of everyday spirituality. So I want to just highlight a little story about my own family. My own family is not a church-going family, as in my mother and brothers and aunts and uncles. That whole side of my family left church life in mid to early 20th century, and it skipped several generations before it kind of came back to me. However, one of the things that I'll always remember my mother told me, she said, you know, there have been 3 times in my life that I believed in God, that I just absolutely knew God existed. And she said that was when I gave birth to each of my children. The act of labor and birth for her was a miracle. So that's the kind of, like, if she was in our group today, she might answer it that way. Let me look through, kind of pull up a couple of, here. In my life, there is one person who has strongly influenced me. Let me tell you about him or her. In my life, there's a person who has strongly influenced me. Let me tell you about him or her. So these questions are designed to get people thinking that maybe these ordinary and extraordinary experiences of life are profound. Now, they get a little more probing, if you will, in the area of faith in particular. But here's one. Tell me of a time you engaged in service or kindness. Do you think God might have been a part of it? So now we're starting to name God as the questions go, and get more specific. Here, let's find another one that's along that line. What is your favorite story in the Bible and why? What is your favorite story in the Bible and why? You know where I got this question? I got this question from the 2012 bishop's election in the New England Synod. It was not in the list of questions that was supposed to happen, but during an open mic section, a high school 16-year-old came to the microphone and asked all of the candidates for bishop, what is your favorite story in the Bible and why? And I remember so clearly, there were 3 different stories. One, pastor talked about Jonah being his favorite story. Another pastor talked about Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus. I talked about Jacob and the angel wrestling in Genesis. How would you answer that question? What is your favorite story in the Bible and why? So you can see the progression that the cards start to take. You can mix them up. You can use them in a number of different ways in small groups, Or you can just use them as a form of your own personal reflection. Pull out one card a day and spend the day thinking about it. I want to end on that question about joy. How would you answer that question? When is a time you experienced great joy? And I want to tell you a little story, a little insight. As many of you know, a part of this group, you may have children or grandchildren who no longer participate in the life of a congregation. And it's tempting, as it has been for me and for my wife, for years, when our son was not participating in the life of a faith community, to ask him, so are you going to church? Where are you going to church? Have you found a church that you like? Several years ago, I had a friend I was talking about this with, and he told me that he no longer asks his children that question. Instead, he asks them, where are you finding grace? Which is another way of asking a question that relates to this. Where are you finding joy? Where are you finding grace, though, specifically using that word? That changes the nature of the conversation. It's no longer a kind of an accusatory, are you going to church? It's really a question of saying, how is God a part of your life? And isn't that ultimately what we want our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren to experience? So I started asking that question from time to time, don't ask it all the time, of my son and now his wife, and I get to ask it now of my grandchildren. Now, they've found a faith community after giving birth to the two grandchildren, but still the more important question is, where are you finding grace in your life? And the stories that they hear and the conversations we have are far richer and more meaningful than anything we've ever had before. So it's been really good to be with you today. I want to give anybody a chance to offer any comments or questions in the Q&A box before we wrap up. But that's kind of what I had in mind sharing for today.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think you've given everybody a lot to think about. Where can we get the set of cards?
Sure, there's two places. One is everydayspirituality.org, O-R-G. And the other is you can email my assistant, Martha White, M-White, W-H-Y-T-E, at nesynod.org. Either of those two places.
Thank you so much, Bishop Hazelwood, for joining us today and for talking to us about how to get up from this chair and go be spiritual.
There you go. Enjoy, everybody.
Have a great day.